Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little quieter, a little darker, and a lot more uncomfortable than most people expect. So, dim the lights, put the phone face down, loosen your shoulders, and get comfortable. You don't need to visualize anything too vividly tonight. Just let the words drift past while your brain slowly clocks out for the day. Because tonight, we're talking about prisoners. Not the modern kind. Not cells, uniforms, meal schedules, or reform programs, but the older, messier version of punishment. Back when prison wasn't really a thing yet. It was more of a temporary inconvenience on the way to something worse. And yes, that does mean this is one of those historical topics where people discover once again that the past somehow managed to be both simpler and significantly more horrifying. Of course it did. So let's ease into it. For most of human history, societies didn't believe in prison as a long-term solution. Locking someone up, feeding them, housing them, guarding them, all of that costs money. And pre-modern states absolutely hated spending money on people they already disliked. So instead of prison sentences, you had fines, mutilations, exile, forced labor, execution, or public humiliation. Quick, decisive, and ideally over by lunchtime. Prison, when it existed at all, was usually just a holding pen, a place where you waited. You waited for your trial. You waited for your punishment. You waited for someone to pay for you. Or you waited to die. Very soothing system, really. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, the Code of Hammurabi didn't waste time with incarceration. If you stole something, you paid it back many times over. If you injured someone, the same injury came back to you. And if you annoyed the wrong person badly enough, the gods apparently wanted you dead. No cell block required. Ancient Egypt wasn't much different. People could be detained briefly, but the real punishments were beatings, forced labor, or execution. If you were locked up, it was likely in a temple storehouse or administrative building, basically wherever there happened to be a door and a guard. Comfort was not part of the design brief. And then we get to ancient Greece, where prison as punishment was still not the point. Athens had a public jail, but it was mostly for debtors and people awaiting execution. Socrates famously spent his final days there, calmly discussing philosophy while everyone else probably wondered why he wasn't trying harder to escape. He could have, by the way. He just chose not to. Very on brand. Roman prisons were even less interested in rehabilitation. The Romans were incredibly organized, but they had zero interest in keeping criminals around longer than necessary. Carceres, their prisons, were dark, overcrowded, and used mostly for temporary confinement. If you were sent there, it was not a sentence. It was a pause, a narrative ellipsis before something sharp or terminal happened to you. Slaves, of course, didn't even get that courtesy. They were punished privately, violently, and often permanently. Roman law cared deeply about property, and enslaved people were property. The end. So when did things really start to get bad in that slow, medieval, extremely damped way everyone secretly expects? Ah yes, the Middle Ages. A period that somehow took all of these older ideas and made them colder, darker, and smellier. Medieval Europe still didn't use prison sentences the way we do today. Instead, jails were holding spaces. Castles had dungeons, towns had lockups, monasteries had cells. None of them were designed for long-term habitation. Light was optional, airflow was a rumor, hygiene was something that happened to other people. If you were arrested in a medieval town, you might be thrown into a cellar, a tower room, or a literal hole in the ground. Sometimes you were chained, sometimes you weren't. Sometimes you shared the space with 10 other people, sometimes with rats. The rats, frankly, were probably better fed. Food was not guaranteed. In many places, prisoners had to rely on family or friends to bring them meals. If no one showed up, that was unfortunate. The jailer was not responsible for your survival beyond keeping you technically alive enough to face judgment. And even that was negotiable. We should also talk about money, because medieval justice loved money almost as much as it loved suffering.
If you had wealth, prison was often avoidable. Fines could replace physical punishment. Bribes could speed things along. Better accommodations could be arranged. There are records of noble prisoners living in relative comfort, with servants, furniture, and decent food. Basically house arrest with thicker walls. Everyone else, of course, got the authentic experience. Debtors were a special category of misery. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you could be jailed indefinitely. Not because anyone expected you to magically earn money while locked up, but because suffering was seen as morally instructive. Also because it applied pressure to your family. Very community-focused, really. In England, debtor prisons became infamous. People could spend years, decades even, locked away over relatively small sums. Families would sometimes live with them inside the prison to save money. Children grew up behind bars. Entire micro-societies formed, complete with internal hierarchies and informal economies, all because someone missed a payment. And then there were the people accused of crimes so vague that imprisonment itself became the punishment. Suspicion of heresy, political disloyalty, saying the wrong thing near someone important. These prisoners might sit for months or years without trial. Records were slow, officials were slower, and justice, as always, was in no hurry. Church prisons deserve a quiet mention here. Monasteries and episcoparies operated their own detention spaces. Clergy accused of wrongdoing were often confined in ecclesiastical prisons, which were sometimes marginally cleaner but psychologically intense. Isolation, silence, constant prayer. Less chains, more existential dread. Which brings us gently, softly, to the concept of torture. Because yes, while prisons weren't meant for punishment, they absolutely became places where punishment happened anyway. Interrogation rooms were often attached to jails. Pain was considered a valid tool for extracting truth. And since prisoners were already dehumanized by their confinement, it was easy to escalate. If someone confessed under torture, that was good enough. If they didn't, that was suspicious. A very fair system. Still, most medieval punishments were public. Hanging, whipping, branding, exile. The prison was just the prelude, a holding pattern while the town gathered and the scaffold was prepared. In that sense, prison life before prisons was strangely anticlimactic. You weren't serving time, you were killing time. And time in those spaces moved slowly. Darkness blurred days together. Hunger made hours stretch. Illness spread quickly. Fleas, lice, dysentery, infections. Medical care did not exist. If you got sick, that was between you and God. God, historically, was not very responsive. Women prisoners faced additional problems. Mixed-gender confinement was common. Abuse was common. Pregnancy in jail was not rare. Children born in captivity were sometimes raised there until someone decided what to do with them, which again is a sentence no one ever expects to hear calmly narrated, but here we are. And yet, despite all of this, medieval prisons were not designed to hold everyone. They couldn't. Space was limited. Resources were limited, which is why imprisonment remained temporary for most people. Justice wanted you processed and removed, preferably quickly. It isn't until much later, as states grew more centralized and bureaucratic, that prison slowly transformed into a sentence rather than a pause. But we're not there yet, not even close. So for now, let's let our minds drift in that uncomfortable in-between, a world where punishment was immediate, mercy was rare, and prison was just the place where you waited to find out how badly history had decided to treat you. In the next part, we'll drift into specific stories, named prisoners, famous captives, royals, traitors, and people who annoyed kings just a little too much. Because, of course, the higher you climbed, the harder the fall, and the dungeons reserved for elites had their own special flavor of misery. But for now, just let this settle. The past didn't lock people up to forget about them. It locked them up so it could decide what to do next. and that decision was rarely kind. Now that we've eased into the general unpleasantness, let's float gently upward in the social hierarchy. Because one of history's favorite ironies is that even when prisons weren't meant to be permanent, they still managed to temporarily ruin the lives of people who absolutely believed they were above all this. Royalty, nobility, important people with very breakable egos. Being a high-status prisoner before prisons existed was different. Not better, exactly, just more complicated. You were less likely to starve immediately, but much more likely to spend long nights staring at stone walls, wondering which cousin was about to inherit your lands. Take medieval kings, for example. Kings were not supposed to be imprisoned. That was the whole point of being a king. God chose you. Crowns were sacred. Touching one was practically a theological crime. So when kings did end up captured, everyone involved suddenly got very nervous. Because now what? You couldn't just toss a king into a hole and forget about him. That was politically dangerous. Executing him could cause rebellion. Letting him go could cause more war. So instead, you kept him somewhere secure enough to pretend this wasn't deeply awkward. Enter the castle prison. Castles weren't built as prisons, but they were excellent at becoming them. Towers, keeps, fortified rooms with limited exits. A captured noble might be housed in a tower chamber with a bed, a fireplace, maybe even tapestries. He might dine decently, he might have a chaplain, he might write letters, but he was still trapped. And captivity for nobles was less about physical suffering and more about psychological erosion. Days filled with waiting, negotiations dragging on, ransoms discussed endlessly, power slipping away one rumor at a time. Richard the Lionheart is a classic example. Brave crusader king, legendary warrior, and also famously captured in 1192 while traveling home in disguise, because of course he was. He ended up imprisoned by Duke Leopold of Austria, then handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor. Richard wasn't chained in a dungeon. He lived in castles. He was treated with a level of respect, but his kingdom was drained paying his ransom. His brother schemed at home. His authority weakened. By the time he was released, the damage was done. Prison didn't break his body, it broke his political momentum. That was often the real punishment for elites. Queens could be imprisoned too, usually for reasons that sounded polite on paper and brutal in practice. Accusations of adultery, political inconvenience, being related to the wrong faction. Queens were rarely executed outright. Instead, they were confined. Convents were a popular option. Technically religious retirement, practically permanent house arrest. A queen sent to a convent lost her influence, her income, her children, and her voice. But she was still alive, which made everyone feel better about themselves. Isabella of France did this to her husband, Edward II, after overthrowing him. Edward's imprisonment ended badly. Isabella's reputation did not recover gracefully. Medieval politics had a way of making everyone look terrible by the end. And then there were the princes. Princes were extremely imprisonable. Spare heirs were dangerous. Rival claimants were inconvenient. So locking them up somewhere quiet was an elegant solution. The Tower of London, for example, was used repeatedly for this purpose. Despite modern myths, it wasn't originally built as a prison. It just kept turning into one. Young nobles raised in captivity often grew up emotionally warped, suspicious, paranoid, or deeply passive. Some emerged eager for revenge. Others simply disappeared into obscurity once released, having lost the sense that life was something they could control. And again, no one called this a prison sentence. It was just keeping them safe. For years.
Now let's drift down a level. Lesser nobles, knights, wealthy merchants, people important enough to be noticed, but not important enough to be handled delicately. These prisoners often occupied town jails or castle basements. Conditions varied wildly. Some paid for comfort, some couldn't.
Some were chained, some weren't, but all of them were vulnerable to delay. Court dates could be postponed, paperwork lost, officials replaced. Justice moved at the speed of whoever benefited most from it moving slowly. And if you were accused of something political, time was your enemy. The longer you were held, the more irrelevant your innocence became. Public opinion shifted, alliances dissolved. Eventually, punishment felt inevitable simply because you'd been imprisoned so long already, a self-fulfilling prophecy made of damp stone. One of the strangest features of pre-modern imprisonment was how porous it could be. People escaped, constantly. Guards were underpaid, walls were old, doors were symbolic. Prisoners bribed their way out, climbed out windows, dug through walls with tools smuggled in by friends. Which is why jailers often resorted to chains, heavy iron restraints, ankles, wrists, necks. These weren't about punishment so much as logistics. You couldn't run very far while dragging 30 pounds of metal. Still, escapes happened, and when they did, consequences were harsh. Recaptured prisoners were treated worse, shackled tighter, fed less. The system adapted through cruelty. Let's also acknowledge that many prisoners weren't criminals at all. They were hostages, taken during wars, held to guarantee treaties, used as bargaining chips, children included. Hostage-taking was normalized. Noble families expected it. Sending a son to live at a rival court wasn't always hostile. Sometimes it was a sign of trust. But if relations soured, that guest could very quickly become a prisoner. Again, not officially, just practically. And the emotional toll of this kind of captivity was immense. Medieval letters from imprisoned nobles are filled with anxiety, boredom, despair, and obsession over tiny comforts, requests for better bedding, complaints about drafts, descriptions of dreams, repeated appeals for release. People who had once commanded armies reduced to asking for candles. Which brings us gently back to the lower classes, because while nobles waited in relative comfort, common prisoners experienced imprisonment as a kind of slow erasure. Town jails were filthy, overcrowded, loud. Prisoners slept on straw if they were lucky, on stone if they weren't. Disease spread rapidly, mortality was high. And again, food was your responsibility. If no one cared enough to bring you bread, that was simply how it ended. Some towns charged prisoners fees for chains, for bedding, for release. Yes, even release. You paid to get out of jail. If you couldn't pay, you stayed. A beautifully circular system. And if you died inside, your family might still owe the debt. There's a quiet cruelty to all of this that's easy to miss. Imprisonment wasn't meant to be humane. It wasn't meant to be just. It was meant to be functional. And functionality meant pressure. Pressure on bodies, pressure on families, pressure on communities. By the late medieval period, incarceration was becoming more common, but still not standardized. No rehabilitation, no fixed terms, just waiting. Waiting for trial. Waiting for ransom. Waiting for execution, waiting for someone to remember you. And many weren't remembered. So as we drift toward the next part, keep that image soft and unfocused. Stone walls, flickering light, a prisoner counting days without knowing what number matters. Next, we'll sink into the spaces themselves, the physical reality of medieval lockups. Towers, dungeons, pits, and holes that technically qualified as rooms, because if you're going to wait for justice, history made sure you did it somewhere deeply uncomfortable, and somehow completely ordinary. Now let's gently drift away from the people and sink into the places themselves, because before prisons were institutions, they were spaces. awkward, repurposed, badly lit spaces that were never meant to hold human beings for very long, which is exactly why they did such an effective job of wearing people down. There was no standard prison design, no best practices, no handbook titled How to Store Unwanted Humans. Instead, communities used whatever they had: towers, cellars, storehouses, gatehouses, pits, sometimes literal holes in the ground with a ladder that only went one way. Castles, once again, were the multi-tool of medieval misery. They had thick walls, strong doors, and guards already on site. So when someone needed to be held, a spare room became a cell, a basement became a dungeon, a tower chamber became a very expensive waiting room for regret. The word dungeon, by the way, comes from donjon, meaning the main tower of a castle, not originally a torture pit, just a keep. Language, like justice, evolved strangely. Tower prisons were common for high-status captives. These rooms might have windows, fireplaces, and enough space to pace, which sounds almost pleasant until you remember the windows were narrow slits, the fireplaces smoked badly, and pacing the same few steps for months does something odd to the human brain. Lower-status prisoners were more likely to end up below ground. Cellars and basements were ideal because they were dark, cool, and already unpleasant. They flooded easily, they smelled worse, and again, food was your responsibility. If no one cared enough to bring you bread, that was simply how it ended. Some towns charged prisoners fees for chains, for bedding, for release. Yes, even release. You paid to get out of jail. If you couldn't pay, you stayed. A beautifully circular system. And if you died inside, your family might still owe the debt. There's a quiet cruelty to all of this that's easy to miss. Imprisonment wasn't meant to be humane. It wasn't meant to be just. It was meant to be functional. And functionality meant pressure. Pressure on bodies, pressure on families, pressure on communities. By the late medieval period, incarceration was becoming more common, but still not standardized. No rehabilitation, no fixed terms, just waiting. Waiting for trial, waiting for ransom, waiting for execution, waiting for someone to remember you. And many weren't remembered. So as we drift toward the next part, keep that image soft and unfocused. Stone walls, flickering light, a prisoner counting days without knowing what number matters. Next, we'll sink into the spaces themselves, the physical reality of medieval lockups, towers, dungeons, pits, and holes that technically qualified as rooms, because if you're going to wait for justice, history made sure you did it somewhere deeply uncomfortable, and somehow completely ordinary.
Pits were exactly what they sound like. Deep holes dug into the earth, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes not. Prisoners were lowered in and left there. Food might be dropped down occasionally. Light was minimal. Escape was impossible without help. Some pits had names, which is never a good sign. The oubliette, from the French oublier, meaning to forget, is the most famous. And yes, the implication is exactly what you think it is. You put someone there so you could forget about them, or at least forget about them long enough for the problem to solve itself. Were oubliettes as common as popular imagination suggests? Probably not, but they existed, and the idea behind them tells you everything you need to know about how pre-modern societies thought about confinement. Out of sight, out of mind, out of options. Town jails were slightly more organized, but not by much. These were usually small buildings near the town hall or market. They had a few rooms, iron bars, and a rotating cast of deeply underpaid guards. Prisoners were mixed together regardless of crime, gender, age, or health. Noise was constant. Privacy did not exist. Imagine trying to sleep while someone nearby is coughing, praying, crying, or negotiating with a rat over a crust of bread.
very calming. Sanitation was theoretical. Buckets were used for waste. Sometimes they were emptied, sometimes they weren't. If you were lucky, there was a drain. If you weren't, you learned to stop noticing certain smells. Which brings us to disease, because wherever people were confined together in damp, dirty spaces, illness followed. Dysentery, typhus, skin infections, respiratory diseases. Prisoners weakened by hunger succumbed quickly. Death in custody was common and unremarkable. And no one investigated. Why would they? You were already imprisoned. That was explanation enough. Light was another subtle torment. Many cells had none. Prisoners lived in darkness or near darkness for weeks or months. Circadian rhythms dissolved, days blurred. Some prisoners scratched marks into walls to track time. Others gave up and let the hours melt together. There are medieval accounts of prisoners losing their sense of self, not dramatically, just gradually. Names mattered less, memories softened, the future stopped feeling real, which, if you're designing a system to break resistance, is quite effective. And yet, none of this was considered excessive. This was normal. This was just what happened when someone was detained. Let's talk briefly about chains, because they were everywhere. Iron restraints were used to prevent escape, but they also served as a visual reminder of power. A chained prisoner was a controlled prisoner. Even nobles were sometimes chained, though often more lightly. Symbolism mattered. Chains rubbed skin raw. They restricted movement. They made sleep difficult. Long-term chaining caused joint damage and infections. But again, no one was planning for long-term incarceration. If you were chained for months, that was because the system was moving slowly, not because anyone thought ahead. And then there were jailers. Jailers were not correctional officers. They were contractors, appointees, or locals who needed income. Their job was to keep prisoners from leaving. Everything else was optional. Kindness varied, corruption was common, abuse was frequent. Some jailers extorted prisoners, others sold privileges, better food, fewer chains, access to visitors. Even access to sunlight could have a price. If you could pay, prison became more bearable. If you couldn't, it became shorter in a different way. Women prisoners experienced these spaces differently and often worse. Separate facilities were rare. Vulnerability was constant. Pregnant women gave birth in cells. Children lived alongside adult prisoners. The idea of protection simply didn't apply. And yet, despite all of this, prisons were busy places. People came and went. Trials happened. Punishments were carried out. Prison was a waypoint, not a destination. Which is why some prisoners tried to make the best of it. They formed friendships, shared food, told stories, played games with improvised pieces. Humans, inconveniently, adapt. There were records of prisoners composing poetry, writing letters, even running small businesses from inside jails. Debt negotiations happened through bars. Lawyers visited. Priests listened. Life continued, warped but recognizable. And then, one day, it ended. You were released, or executed, or exiled, or ransomed, or forgotten long enough that release became irrelevant. Release itself could be disorienting. Former prisoners emerged weakened, sick, changed, stigmatized. People remembered where you'd been. Employers hesitated. Neighbors whispered. Even if you were innocent, imprisonment marked you. And for some, prison followed them psychologically long after they left. Nightmares, anxiety, obsession with confinement, a constant awareness of doors and exits. Trauma, though no one called it that. All of this existed before prisons as we understand them, before sentences measured in years, before ideas of reform or rehabilitation. This was justice as a blunt instrument, used briefly and put away. As we drift toward the next part, we'll move from spaces to people again. Ordinary prisoners, debtors, peasants, the anonymous masses who filled these cells and left little trace behind. Because while kings wrote letters and nobles left records, most prisoners vanished quietly. and history, as always, was fine with that. So settle back in. Let the stone walls fade into the background. Let the torchlight flicker. We're not finished waiting yet. Let's drift now toward the people history barely noticed at all. Not kings, not queens, not disgraced nobles writing letters on good parchment. Just ordinary people. The majority. The ones whose names were never recorded because, frankly, no one thought they mattered enough to remember. These were the prisoners who filled medieval lockups most consistently. Peasants, laborers, servants, artisans, widows, teenagers who made a bad decision, men who owed money, women who annoyed the wrong neighbor, people whose crimes were small, vague, or entirely invented.
For them, imprisonment before prisons existed wasn't a political inconvenience or a temporary embarrassment. It was a collapse. Most ordinary prisoners were arrested for debt, not violent crime, not grand theft, just unpaid rent, missed loans, or obligations they couldn't meet after a bad harvest, illness, or employer disappearing overnight. Medieval economies were fragile. One setback could ruin you. And when it did, the justice system didn't ask why. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you were locked up. The logic was simple and deeply flawed. Suffering would motivate repayment. Families would step in. Communities would pressure you. Someone, somewhere, would produce the money. If they didn't, you stayed. There was no sentence length, no automatic release. You waited until the debt was paid, forgiven, or forgotten, which could take years or never happen at all. Debtor prisons were especially grim because they trapped people in a state of permanent uselessness. You couldn't work, you couldn't earn, you couldn't improve your situation. Your presence in jail was meant to remind everyone else what happened when obligations weren't met. Moral instruction through slow decay. And yet, debtors often made up the majority of prisoners in medieval towns. Entire sections of jails were filled with people who had committed no crime beyond being poor at the wrong time. Then there were people accused of petty offenses, theft of food, trespassing, public disorder, breaking local customs no one had written down but everyone enforced aggressively. These prisoners often waited days or weeks for judgment, crammed into cells with debtors and accused criminals. Trials, when they happened, were brief. Evidence was flexible. Character mattered more than facts. If you were known as troublesome, guilt came easily. If you were known as obedient, mercy was possible. But prison had already done its work by then. Even short-term imprisonment could be devastating. A few weeks away from work could mean lost employment, lost housing, lost social standing. Families struggled in your absence. Children went hungry. Wives begged neighbors for help. Husbands returned to nothing. Women were imprisoned more often than people expect, not equally, but consistently. Accusations of disorderly behavior, sexual impropriety, theft, or simply being inconvenient could land women in jail. Pregnant women were not exempt, mothers were not exempt. Children sometimes entered prison with their parents, not because anyone thought it was appropriate, but because there was nowhere else to put them. A toddler in a cell was less shocking than letting them starve outside. And so, children grew up hearing chains rattle, watching adults argue, learning early that authority was unpredictable and usually unpleasant. There were also prisoners who never technically broke the law at all. People detained for their own safety, suspected vagrants, migrants without local ties, the mentally ill, the socially disruptive. Locking them up was easier than addressing the problem. Again, prison wasn't punishment, it was storage. Storage of people who didn't fit neatly anywhere else. And because these prisoners lacked status, their suffering was invisible. No letters, no records, no famous anecdotes, just brief mentions in town accounts. Fed prisoner, buried prisoner,
released prisoner, sometimes not even that. Death in jail was common and unremarkable. Bodies were removed, cells reused, life went on. There were no investigations, no apologies. If someone died while imprisoned, it simply confirmed that they had been weak. Which brings us to one of the quietest horrors of pre-prison imprisonment, the complete absence of oversight. There were no inspections, no standards, no outside review. A jail could be run badly for decades without consequence. Abuse was local. Justice was personal. If a jailer was cruel, that was unfortunate. If a jailer was kind, that was luck. Some prisoners tried to appeal directly to authorities. They shouted through windows, smuggled notes, begged priests to intervene. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Power was distant, slow, and uninterested. And yet, in this bleakness, people still tried to maintain fragments of normal life. They shared stories, sang quietly, formed temporary families. Human beings are annoyingly resilient that way. Prisoners developed routines, morning prayers, evening conversations, a shared understanding of who controlled which corner of the cell. Small rituals created the illusion of stability in a place designed to strip it away. But make no mistake, most prisoners emerged changed, if they emerged at all. Imprisonment carried stigma, even if you were innocent, even if you were released without punishment. People remembered where you'd been. Trust eroded. Opportunities vanished. Social death often followed physical confinement. For some, prison was the beginning of a downward spiral. Once labeled troublesome, future accusations came easily. Repeat imprisonment was common. The system fed of familiarity.
And this is where we begin to see the slow transition toward prisons as permanent institutions. Not yet sentences, not yet reform, but longer confinement, more repeat offenders, more people cycling through the same spaces again and again. Authorities began to notice that jails were always full, not because crime was rising dramatically, but because social pressures were increasing. Urbanization, economic instability, population growth, more people, fewer resources, tighter control. And with that came a quiet shift in thinking. Maybe confinement itself could be the punishment. Maybe time could replace spectacle. Maybe people could simply be kept. But we're not there yet, not fully. For now, prison remains what it has always been, a pause, a waiting room, a place where ordinary lives stalled out quietly while history focused on louder things. In the next part, we'll follow that shift forward, toward early modern Europe, toward longer sentences, toward workhouses, bridewells, and the uneasy idea that locking people up might actually solve something. So take a slow breath. Let the murmurs fade. Let the cell door close softly, not with a slam, but with a tired, inevitable click. The waiting continues. And at some point, almost without anyone announcing it, waiting stopped being temporary. This is the quiet moment where history shifts its weight. Not dramatically, not with a declaration or reform act, just a slow realization, shared by magistrates, city councils, and deeply tired officials, that people were staying in jail longer than anyone had planned. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and suddenly imprisonment itself was doing the work that public punishment used to do. Early modern Europe, roughly the 1500s and 1600s, was a time of growing populations and shrinking patience. Cities expanded, poverty became more visible, vagrancy laws multiplied. Authorities grew anxious about people who moved too much, worked too little, or existed without clear purpose. And when societies feel anxious, they build walls. Not new prisons yet, not really, but more places designed specifically to hold people for longer periods of time. Bridewells, workhouses, houses of correction.
institutions with names that sounded polite enough to reassure everyone involved. Bridewells, named after Bridewell Palace in London, were originally meant to reform the idle poor, which already tells you how this is going to go. The idea was simple and very confident. Put people to work, teach discipline, fix moral failings through labor. Of course, in practice, Bridewells were harsh. Prisoners were forced to perform repetitive, exhausting tasks, beating hemp, breaking stones, grinding grain. Work was monotonous and often pointless. The goal wasn't productivity, it was obedience. Time itself became the punishment. Sentences were still vague, until corrected, until behavior improves, until authorities are satisfied, which meant release depended on perception, not progress. If you looked repentant enough, maybe you left. If not, you stayed. And once again, wealth changed everything. Those with money found ways out. Those without learned how heavy days could feel when stacked together endlessly. Workhouses expanded across Europe. They targeted the poor, the unemployed, the homeless. Being imprisoned was no longer just about wrongdoing. It was about failing to fit neatly into an economic system that demanded constant productivity. And if you didn't fit, you were confined. Inside these early institutions, conditions were still bleak. Overcrowding, disease, poor nutrition, strict discipline. Silence was often enforced. Talking could be punished. Idleness was treated as rebellion. The idea of reform existed mostly on paper. In reality, the system relied on exhaustion. Break the spirit, shape behavior through fatigue, release people back into society, quieter, weaker, and less likely to cause trouble. It didn't always work. Some prisoners adapted too well. They learned the rhythms, the rules, the small tricks for survival. Others deteriorated. Mental illness worsened. Physical health declined. Mortality remained high. And yet, officials considered this progress, because unlike executions, imprisonment didn't provoke outrage. Unlike mutilation, it didn't permanently mark bodies. It was invisible, hidden behind walls, clean in a way that violence never was. People disappeared into institutions and re-emerged changed, if they re-emerged at all.
This period also saw the rise of long-term political imprisonment, dissidents, religious nonconformists, people who wrote the wrong pamphlet or believed the wrong doctrine. Instead of execution, authorities began choosing confinement. Again, this sounded merciful. It wasn't. Long-term confinement stripped people of relevance. Their ideas faded. Their supporters moved on. When released, they often found the world unrecognizable. Power had shifted. Conversations had ended without them. Time, used deliberately, became a tool of control. And slowly the idea settled in. Prison didn't have to be temporary. It could be the punishment itself. No spectacle, no crowd, just absence. This was deeply appealing to governments trying to maintain order without constantly drawing attention to their cruelty. Prisons kept trouble out of sight, out of mind, very much in the spirit of the oubliette, just with better accounting. But systems built on waiting have a way of filling themselves. Once prisons existed to hold people long-term, more behaviors became imprisonable. Laws multiplied, sentences lengthened, categories expanded. The poor, the idle, the inconvenient, all absorbed quietly. And still there was no unified philosophy, no agreement on how long was enough, no understanding of psychological harm, just an assumption that confinement was neutral, that time passed the same for everyone. It didn't. Prisoners described time as thick, heavy, uneven. Days dragged, nights stretched, the mind circled endlessly, memory sharpened or dissolved. Some prisoners marked time obsessively, others refused to think about it at all.
Guards noticed changes too. Prisoners became withdrawn, less responsive, less angry sometimes, but also less present. Compliance replaced resistance, and compliance looked like success. By now, prisons were no longer accidental, they were intentional, still flawed, still brutal, but permanent enough to reshape how societies thought about punishment. The waiting room had become the destination. And once that happened, there was no going back. In the next part, we'll slow down even further. We'll listen to prison time itself, how people experienced long confinement without modern understanding of mental health, how boredom, repetition, and silence altered perception. Because when prison becomes the sentence, the real punishment isn't pain, it's time. And time, once it turns against you, is very hard to escape. By the time imprisonment quietly became the punishment, no one had really stopped to ask what time would do to a person once it was locked in a room with them. Not pain, not fear, just time. Endless, repetitive, poorly lit time. People outside prisons experienced time as movement. Seasons changed, crops grew and failed, children aged, wars started and ended. Inside, time behaved differently. It thickened, it pooled, it stopped flowing and started pressing. Prisoners wrote about this when they could write at all. They didn't describe agony so much as distortion. Hours stretched, days lost edges, weeks became indistinguishable from each other. Without variety, the mind lost its markers. Morning looked like evening, evening felt like morning. Sleep came unpredictably. Dreams became more vivid than waking life simply because they offered change. Silence played a major role in this. Early modern prisons increasingly enforced quiet. Not always intentionally. Sometimes there just wasn't much to say. Other times, silence was a rule, backed by punishment. Silence did strange things. Prisoners became hyper-aware of small sounds, footsteps, keys, dripping water, breathing. These noises took on meaning. Footsteps could signal food, release, punishment, or nothing at all. The uncertainty mattered more than the outcome. Boredom, too, became its own force. Not mild boredom, not the kind cured by distraction, but the deep, grinding boredom of repetition without purpose. Workhouses tried to fill this with labor, but monotonous work only replaced empty time with empty motion. Break hemp, turn the wheel, carry stones, repeat. The body moved, the mind stalled. Some prisoners counted, steps across the cell, cracks in the wall, bricks, breaths. Others recited prayers endlessly. Prayer provided structure, so did madness sometimes. Talking to oneself filled the silence. Authorities noticed these effects, but misunderstood them. Withdrawal looked like obedience. Emotional flatness looked like reform. A prisoner who stopped resisting was considered improved. In reality, many had simply retreated inward. Isolation made this worse. Solitary confinement existed long before it was named. People were separated for discipline, safety, or convenience. Alone in a cell, without conversation, without stimulation, prisoners unraveled quietly. Hallucinations were reported, voices, lights, sensations of movement. The mind, deprived of input, created its own. Again, no one documented this systematically. It was anecdotal, dismissed, or interpreted spiritually. If a prisoner heard voices, perhaps God was speaking, or demons. Either way, it wasn't the jail's problem. Memory changed, too. Some prisoners remembered childhood in vivid detail. Others forgot faces. Names slipped away. Language softened. People struggled to articulate thoughts after long confinement. Speech slowed. Sentences shortened. Time did not sharpen people. It wore them smooth.
And yet, some adapted remarkably well.
They built internal routines, mental schedules, imaginary conversations, rehearsed future moments. Humans are endlessly inventive when trapped. But even adaptation had a cost. When release finally came, it often arrived as a shock. Former prisoners described stepping outside as overwhelming, light too bright, noise too loud, space too open, choices too many. The world moved faster than they remembered. Some longed to return to confinement, not because it was pleasant, but because it was familiar, predictable, safe in its narrowness. This unsettled authorities. A punishment that made people dependent on it felt uncomfortable. But again, there was no framework to address this, so the system continued. By now, prisons had become institutions in both name and function. They were built, staffed, and managed. They had rules, schedules, and hierarchies. And yet, the core experience of being a prisoner, the endless, intangible weight of waiting, remained largely unchanged. This is what most history books skip over. They mention reforms, architects, and legislation. They describe cells, bars, and work assignments, but they rarely dwell on the quiet, cumulative effects of months and years spent in spaces designed to slow time to a viscous pace. Inside the walls, prisoners experienced a strange flattening of life. Joy and grief arrived as distant phenomena. News from outside trickled in sporadically. Letters were censored or delayed. Days were measured not by sunlight, but by routine. Meal at dawn, work in the morning, exercise if allowed, evening ration, lights out, rinse and repeat. Monotony dominated, but monotony was never neutral. It reshaped perception. It warped memory. The past seemed further away. The future seemed uncertain. The present stretched until it became almost tangible in its heaviness. And yet, this was considered progress. Administrators and reformers applauded predictability. Silence was praised. Compliance was praised. Human beings, fundamentally, were treated like machines. Respond correctly, produce labor, wait quietly, and eventually you will be corrected. Of course, humans are not machines, and the psychological toll was profound. Anxiety became pervasive, hallucinations were common, depression, agitation, and despair were omnipresent. Yet these symptoms were interpreted as either moral failing or spiritual trial, not a predictable consequence of confinement. Some prisoners developed rituals to mark time, counting bricks, tracing patterns in the floor, reciting prayers, repeating small motions in precise sequences. These rituals were adaptive. They offered structure in a world stripped of natural rhythm. They also became comforting anchors in otherwise hollow days. Others gave up entirely. They stopped marking time. They let the world pass. They stopped resisting. They became ghosts within the walls. Still alive, still breathing, still counted on rolls, but largely absent from life as anyone outside understood it. And yet, the world beyond the prison walls continued. Seasons changed, governments passed laws, families grew older, remarried, or died. The distance between inside and outside stretched, creating a form of social amnesia. Prisoners returned to lives they could barely recognize or never returned at all. This invisible toll, the flattening of human experience, the slow erosion of connection, identity, and vitality, is perhaps the truest hallmark of imprisonment before prisons existed. It is what makes confinement so effective and so quietly cruel, even when overt brutality has been reduced or hidden behind brick and mortar. And it is what echoes through the centuries. Modern incarceration, despite legal protections and attempts at reform, carries the same invisible weight. Time itself becomes the instrument of control. So, as we continue our slow journey, let us linger here for a moment. Let the footsteps echo down the corridors. Let the cell doors click softly. Let the hours stretch. Let the waiting remind us that punishment is not only measured in pain, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible erosion of life itself. Because in these halls, long before modern prisons existed, waiting was not just a pause. Waiting was the sentence. The penitentiary emerged from this thinking. The word itself comes from penitence, repentance. The prison was no longer just a place to wait. It was a place to become someone else, preferably quieter. Solitary confinement expanded dramatically. Prisoners were separated into individual cells. Conversation was restricted or forbidden. Meals were eaten alone. Work was done alone. Even exercise, if allowed, happened in isolation. Guards enforced silence aggressively. A whisper could result in punishment. Looking at another prisoner could be interpreted as defiance. Human connection became contraband. Officials believed this was humane. There were fewer beatings, less visible suffering. Everything looked calm, orderly, clean. Inside, people unraveled. Prisoners reported anxiety, confusion, despair. Hallucinations increased. Some lost the ability to speak fluently. Others rocked back and forth for hours. Self-harm appeared more frequently, though it was rarely acknowledged. Still, reformers praised the system. Silence looked like success. Work was also reimagined. Labor was no longer just exhausting, it was supposed to be morally uplifting. Prisoners made shoes, wove cloth, assembled goods. Their productivity justified their confinement. But profits mattered too. Prisons became economic engines. Cheap labor benefited states and private contractors. Rehabilitation and exploitation became difficult to separate. And once money entered the picture, incarceration expanded further. Sentences became standardized. Years replaced vague waiting. Judges assigned time as punishment, confident that time itself was neutral, objective, fair. It wasn't.
Prison time weighed differently, depending on who you were. The poor suffered more. The isolated broke faster. Those with education adapted better. Inequality followed prisoners inside just as it had outside. Meanwhile, the public grew comfortable with the idea of prisons as permanent fixtures. They were out of sight, out of mind. People inside became abstractions, numbers, categories. Criminals, debtors, vagrants, dissidents. The waiting room had evolved into a system. And systems, once built, resist change. Prisons expanded. New buildings rose. Old ones filled. Reform created structure, not mercy. The original idea that prison would replace brutality felt increasingly hollow. Violence hadn't disappeared. It had simply been absorbed into routine, into policy, into architecture. Punishment became quieter, longer, more efficient. And by now, the transformation was complete. What began as temporary confinement had become a way of life for thousands, then millions, across countries, across centuries. The irony, of course, is that prison was never designed to do all this. It drifted into the role, slowly, casually, without much resistance, which makes it very difficult to leave behind. In the next part, we'll pull back and look at the full shape of this evolution, how a system built on waiting reshaped justice itself, and how modern incarceration still carries the fingerprints of oubliettes, towers, and damp stone cells. So let the silence settle once more. Let the orderly corridors stretch out ahead. Let the clocks tick evenly now, measured and official. The waiting has been given a schedule.
And somehow that makes it heavier.
Even in the quietest, most isolated prisons, small threads of connection managed to persist. Letters, when they arrived, were miracles, rare glimpses of the outside world, proof that someone, somewhere, remembered you existed. Of course, delivery was unreliable. Censors intercepted words, officials delayed messages. Some letters never arrived. And even when they did, the news was often stale, broken, or painful. Prisoners clung to these fragments. They read them repeatedly, traced the ink with fingers, memorized phrases. Each word became a lifeline, each sentence a bridge back to humanity. The absence of communication, however, reinforced the slow drift toward invisibility. Days became not just long, but almost meaningless without feedback from the world beyond the walls. Dreams also became crucial. In the absence of sensory variety, prisoners' minds created their own worlds. Some dreamed vividly of home, of family, of freedom. Others imagined futures they could never reach. These dreams were both solace and torment. Solace because they reminded prisoners they were alive. Torment because they highlighted what had been lost. In some cases, these internal narratives became the only measure of time passing. Counting days was less effective than recounting imagined events, replaying conversations, or reliving past experiences. Memories and dreams replaced calendars, clocks, and routine. In a very real sense, prisoners lived partly in imagined worlds, and those worlds, like the cells themselves, were narrow, repetitive, and isolating. Connections with other prisoners, when allowed, offered relief. Whispered conversations, shared food, mutual comfort. Alliances formed and dissolved, friendships blossomed in hallways of despair, and yet these were fragile, easily broken by guards, punishment, or death. Still, the bonds were proof that even in spaces designed to erase identity, human beings found ways to sustain it. Letters, dreams, and whispered words were small victories. They never replaced freedom, but they softened the edges of confinement. And in the long span of pre-modern imprisonment, these soft edges mattered. They were the difference between surviving and fading into oblivion. As we continue, we'll trace the transition from these fragmented existences toward more formalized systems of incarceration, where architecture, labor, and bureaucratic control codified waiting itself. But for now, we linger with the fragile humanity inside stone walls. Because even when time is the sentence and waiting is the punishment, people find ways to keep themselves just barely alive.